In 2 months, our country will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, granting women the vote. We are able to celebrate this centennial because of what happened in Tennessee at our state capitol on August 18, 1920. It took over 70 years to win the vote. Suffragists were up against forces that feared the doubling of the number of voters who were unpredictable. Forces thought women were lesser beings than men. They particularly didn't want African American women to vote. They believed their religion didn't allow women to conduct activities outside the home. Corporate interests such as manufacturers, the liquor lobby, and the railroads were against it. The right for women to vote was a bitter fight, a struggle, and a political and cultural fight for women's roles in power. The outcome was in doubt until the last minute when one vote made the difference in the House. The TBA is fortunate to have Elaine Weiss, author of The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, to tell us about the 6 turbulent weeks in Nashville in the summer of 1920, leading up to the ratification, as suffragists and anti-suffragists lobbied Tennessee lawmakers with, as Elaine says, bribes, bigotry, bourbon, and the Bible to either ratify or kill the 19th Amendment. Elaine Weiss is an award-winning Baltimore-based journalist and writer whose byline appeared in many national publications. The Woman's Hour, her most recent book, has won critical acclaim from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and the New Yorker. It received the American Bar Association's highest honor, the 2019 Silver Gavel Award. Gloria Steinem said, "Women have always been an equal part of the past. We just haven't been a part of history." Elaine Weiss's story of what happened in Tennessee 100 years ago with its present day relevance is that part of history. Welcome, Elaine Weiss, to the Tennessee Bar Association.
Thank you, Margaret, and I'm honored to be the speaker at your annual meeting this year and thrilled to celebrate the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment with you. As you know, Tennessee plays a starring role in this drama of American women winning the right to vote. And Nashville was the center for the War of the Roses, the final battle over ratification of the 19th Amendment in the summer of 1920, exactly 100 years ago. Tennessee claimed its place in history as the 36th state, the final state needed to ratify. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, but the ratification story is fascinating and instructive, and it is your proud legacy. So it's very appropriate that I bring this story home to you. The legal community also assumes a leading role in this history because fundamentally this is a story about the laws that we as a nation of laws have created to govern us, and what it takes to change the law, to improve the law when necessary. That's what the suffragists worked for 7 decades to do, to change the laws of the land. The law was their tool and their weapon. This is the story of the 19th Amendment, the largest extension of the franchise in our nation's history, giving the vote to 1/2 of the citizens of the nation who were not included when the founding fathers constructed our government supposedly by and for the people. It's the story of how American women's demand for the vote, once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly, methodically transformed into constitutional law. The fight for women's suffrage is one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. And it's one that cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who gets to participate in our government? Who has a voice? And when we say we the people, do we really mean everyone? And of course, we're asking that same question today. In a larger sense, this is an exploration of how change can be made in a democracy and in society. Now, the 19th Amendment was not just a legal change. It wasn't just a constitutional change. It didn't just double the national electorate. It didn't just make women full citizens for the first time. It marked a societal change, a cultural shift about the role and the rights of women in society. Tennesseans trained in the law, working as attorneys, representing their clients, working as legislators, representing their constituents, working as activists and advocates, all take part in making this change in society or in resisting it. The Tennessee Bar Association is deeply involved and deeply conflicted at the time. We find lawyers on both sides of the women's suffrage question, on both sides of the ratification question, on the right side of history and on the wrong side. Now, if you look in most history textbooks, you'll find very little about women's suffrage written. Mostly it's dismissed in a paragraph or maybe even just a sentence, and it goes something like this. In 1848, American women demanded the vote at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And then in 1920, they were given the vote. No, that's not how it happened. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 7 decades to win the vote for American women. And that active verb is very important. Women were not given the vote. They were not granted the vote. Women seized it. The culmination of that quest for women's rights came down to one 6-week furious battle of hand-to-hand combat in the summer of 1920 in Nashville. In the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, giving all women in every state the right to vote in every election. 35 states had already ratified, and 36, or 3/4 of the states in the Union, were needed for full ratification. And Tennessee could be the 36th state. If the Tennessee legislature approved the amendment, it would become the law of the land. If the amendment failed in Tennessee, it could be delayed indefinitely, and the suffragists feared might not be enacted in their lifetimes. The enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the United States was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. By 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for 72 years, since that first outrageous demand for the vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at that Seneca Falls women's rights meeting in 1848. Now, Elizabeth Stanton was the movement's founding legal philosopher. She was a judge's daughter. She grew up steeped in the language and the concepts of the law. As a girl, she would sit in the back of her father's chambers in Johnstown, New York, and listen to her father counsel local citizens on legal matters. Elizabeth noticed that many women came to seek Judge Cady's advice about abusive husbands, financial hardships, the danger of losing their children if they tried to leave the marriage. Elizabeth watched her father sadly shake his head and tell the distraught women in his chambers, "I'm sorry, I cannot help you. As a woman, you have virtually no rights under the law. The law does not protect you." Indeed, at this time in the early 19th century, American women, especially a married woman, had very few legal rights. The laws of coverture ruled her. She could not own property or control her own money. Everything she had belonged to her husband. She, in fact, was considered the property of her husband. Her children also belonged to their father. A mother had no custodial rights. Women could not attend most universities or professional schools. Most occupations were closed to her. She was not supposed to even speak in public. doing what I am doing right now. That was considered promiscuous. A woman could not bring civil suit. She could not testify in a court of law. She could not serve on a jury. And of course, she could not vote. Young Elizabeth was upset by this, but she planned a remedy. She'd take scissors and simply cut out those sections of her father's law books that gave men rights but denied them to women. Judge Cady got wind of his daughter's surgical solution, and he intervened, saying, "Cutting up my law books and statute books won't help. The only remedy is you'll just have to change the laws when you grow up." And he must have thought that was very safe and nicely far-fetched parental advice for his clever and headstrong daughter. He could not imagine that when Elizabeth grew up, she would do just that. She would work to change many of those offending laws, especially those that prevented women from having a say in the policies that governed their lives. In the Declaration of Sentiments that Elizabeth wrote for the Seneca Falls meeting, she tackled many of these legal liabilities that women faced. She actually, in those sentiments, demanded equal pay for equal work, 1848. And she presented a resolution demanding that women have the franchise, the right to vote. Now, many of those attending the meeting, even though they were very progressive reformers, many of them, thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was too radical. It would make them seem ridiculous. But there was a young man in the audience, and he stood up, and he had ridden his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the meeting. And it was a young Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery. He stood up and he said, "No, you must demand the vote. It will never be given to you as it will never be given to me without a fight." And he convinced the other very reluctant participants in the Seneca Falls meeting to adopt Elizabeth Stanton's outrageous call for the vote. And Frederick Douglass would call himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life. Now, it's no coincidence that Douglass was at the Seneca Falls meeting. He'd been invited because he'd worked with Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott and the other organizers of this first women's rights meeting. They'd worked together in the abolition movement because the women we know as the foremothers of suffrage actually began their political careers as abolition workers. And abolition and women's rights were sibling movements through the Civil War. And decades later, in the southern states, women's suffrage was still associated with abolition, which definitely complicated matters when the 19th Amendment landed in Tennessee. Now, in the years following Seneca Falls, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists waged over 900 state, local, and national campaigns for the vote. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities around the nation. And here we see them beginning in buggies. Here's another one. And by the end of the movement, they're campaigning from cars, including from this flower-bedecked car in Chattanooga. The women of the suffrage movement understood that they would have to change hearts and minds before they could hope to change the laws concerning women's equality. The ground must be prepared for legal change, and it wasn't easy. The suffragists also realized that they needed to master the intricacies of the law, as well as the mechanics of politics, if they wanted to accomplish such fundamental alterations. They mastered the state referendum process, even though they could not take part in these referenda. Only men could vote, whether women deserved the right to vote. But women learned how to gather and verify signatures to get women's suffrage on the ballot. Then they mounted elaborate campaigns to convince male voters they were the only voters, to amend state constitutions to allow women to vote. They lost many more of these referenda than they won, but they scored a number of pivotal victories, especially in the Western states. And by 1920, 15 states had granted women full suffrage rights, and several more, including Tennessee, granted limited suffrage. The suffragists used the law to change the law. They invented novel approaches to challenging women's disenfranchisement, including a bold interpretation of the 14th Amendment's rights and privileges of citizenship. Maintaining that under the 14th Amendment, women inherently possess the right to vote, and it was only a matter of exercising it. To prove this, the suffragists undertook acts of civil disobedience to provoke legal test cases. In one of the most famous, more than 150 women, including Susan Anthony and Sojourner Truth, attempted to vote in the 1872 presidential election. I'm going to go back and show you. Susan Anthony was arrested, tried, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. Go back here. And this is her trial transcript. Anthony seized the opportunity to present her argument to the public in more than 50 public lectures, posing the question, is it a crime for a US citizen to vote? Of course, we are asking that same question today too. One of the suffragists' 14th Amendment cases went all the way to the Supreme Court, but the court ruled unanimously in 1875 in Minor versus Happersett that women were not entitled to the vote under the 14th Amendment. Women constituted a special class of non-voting citizens. This put an end to the hope of winning suffrage through the courts. The failure of these legal experiments caused Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton to embark on a new strategy, a constitutional amendment which would supersede all state laws prohibiting women from voting. Based on the language of the 15th Amendment, it read, "The right of citizens to vote be denied or abridged by the US or by any state on account of sex." It was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it was stalled there for 40 years. The amendment was voted down either in committee or on the floor of the House or Senate 28 times. Stymied by the courts and by the legislative process, the suffragists turned to extra legal methods. They developed a whole arsenal of protest tactics, from refusing to pay taxes, claiming no taxation without representation. They also developed marches, parades, outdoor rallies, soapbox speeches, mass demonstrations, and later picketing and hunger strikes. And we're going to take a look at some of these. Here's again a meeting notice. These would be tacked up on fences, on trees, on billboards, rallies, marches. A great march in 1913 in Washington, and there are Tennessee suffragists marching on Pennsylvania Avenue. Here's another archival photograph of women marching, wearing their marching uniforms of white dresses with yellow sashes. Here's a grand march in New York, 40,000 suffragists lining up to march. And here is a march in Nashville, the very first in the South in 1912. Now, these were very controversial, these marches, these, of course, later the picketing and the hunger strikes. They were considered offensive forms of political speech, especially for women. Still, many of these tactics, pioneered by the suffragists, would be adopted by civil rights campaigns to follow later in the 20th century and in the 21st. And they are being used to this very day. It's hard to imagine how brave a woman had to be to march, to demonstrate, to stand up publicly for political equality. The suffragists endured contempt and ridicule in their communities, their churches, their clubs, and in the press. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. In fact, Susan Anthony used to say she could chart the progress of the movement by the projectiles that were thrown at her. When they were no longer rotten eggs and just plain eggs, well, that was progress. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, even Bolsheviks. We're going to look at some very striking images that were used by the anti-suffragists to convince America that women should not vote. Here is one. What would I do, what I would do with the suffragists? Again, it's about keeping women silent. Another, very disturbing, but it gives us a sense of the intensity of the opposition. Again, the anti-suffragists saw it as a binary choice. Either you could be at home, a loving mother and wife, or on the street corner as a crazed zealot. Which do you prefer, the home or the street corner for women? And this is trying to convince men who are voting in a state referendum to vote no on women's suffrage. The suffragists were derided as unattractive, unsexed spinsters. And here we see how they are portrayed. Guess which one is supposedly the suffragists? And the men who supported them, and there were many, were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. Here's one, When Women Vote, and mom is smoking a cigar and reading the sporting news while her husband is holding the screaming babies and is reduced to knitting his own trousers out of her discarded skirts. Another one, Election Day, mom is going to sail off, abandon the family, while dad, again, has to care for the screaming babies. It was one of the contentions of the anti-suffragists that suffrage and the equality and independence that it accorded women was going to destroy the American home. And they weren't subtle about what they feared. Clearly, suffrage was frightening, especially in the South. Now, Tennessee women began organizing to gain the vote in the 1880s. And the first suffrage society was formed in Memphis in 1889. A Nashville suffrage club was established in 1894, and a state league formed in 1897. But organizing in Tennessee was not easy. Southern social mores and traditions, that pedestal where women were supposedly placed, was intended to keep women in her domestic sphere and out of the public square. Her delicate nature might be sullied by touching politics, even by touching a ballot box. Most alarmingly, suffragists were believed to be undermining the chivalry of Southern men. Despite all this, Tennessee women did stand up. They did become activists, and it was not an easy choice. Tennessee suffragists were led by strong women like Lizzie Crozier French, founder of the Knoxville Equal Suffrage Society. She was Tennessee State Association president and active on the national level too. On her voter registration card, finally, in 1920, she listed her occupation as suffragist. Abby Crawford Milton of Chattanooga, first president of the Tennessee League of Women Voters. Elizabeth Merriweather, the Memphis suffrage pioneer. And Frankie Pierce and Dr. Maddie Coleman, who organized Nashville's African American women in their work for suffrage. Also, Nashville's Ann Dallas Dudley, who made suffrage respectable for socially prominent women and served on the National Association board as well, and became the suffragists' best defense against claims that suffs were unattractive and bitter and out to destroy the American home. The suffragists of Tennessee could respond with these scenes of Ann Dudley and maternal bliss in her children's nursery. And Dudley would lead Nashville's suffrage parade in 1912, the first suffrage demonstration in the South, and she was at the head of subsequent parades, marching with her children. Now Tennessee suffragists became bolder. They spoke in the State House, advocating for a constitutional change to voting laws. They held public meetings. They held open air rallies, and they were speaking on street corners. They spoke from the rumble seat of cars. They appointed legislative committees to lobby their state representatives. And they distributed literature at the state and county fairs. Women's clubs formed their own suffrage organizations, like this one from the Nashville Business Women's Equal Suffrage League. Now, thousands of Tennessee women were involved in the movement, and men took notice. Entrepreneurs took notice too, and began advertising to the suffragists. Here's a newspaper advertisement. Women's suffrage means progressiveness. Progress is the road to perfection. And perfection is synonymous with Gloria Supreme Flower. And then there's this rather odd advertisement for Joy's florist in Nashville. Roses for suffragist birthdays, lilies for aunties' funerals. That's anti-suffragists. But resistance also remained strong, and both men and women in Tennessee formed anti-suffrage leagues around the state. Letterheads boasted many prominent family names. The anti and pro-suffrage women faced off at legislative hearings and in letters to the editor pages of all the Tennessee newspapers. This friction played out during the 1917 effort to get a limited suffrage bill through the legislature, which would grant Tennessee women the right to vote in presidential and municipal elections, but still have no voice in choosing their governor, congressmen, US senators, state representatives, all the positions that really held power. The anti-suffragists won that fight in 1917. The suffrage measure lost in the State House. But the tables were turned in 1919 when, in an effort to appease the suffragists and perhaps stave off the 19th, the federal amendment, the Tennessee legislature granted women limited suffrage. But the Tennessee suffragists, though glad they might be able to vote for president, were certainly not appeased or satisfied. They wanted the federal amendment to give them the vote in all elections. While the federal amendment was still stuck in Congress and progress was slow in the states, a new generation of suffragists, the third, grew impatient. They were no longer willing to wait, to plead politely, to ask for the vote. They wanted to demand it. They were willing to be aggressive, rude, disruptive, confrontational, willing to even break the law. A young Quaker woman named Alice Paul left the mainstream suffrage organization to practice more confrontational techniques. Her National Women's Party picketed the White House, protested on the steps of the Capitol, and burned President Woodrow Wilson in effigy. Some Tennessee suffragists, like Sue Shelton White and Lizzie Crozier French, joined the Women's Party and participated in the picketing. Hundreds of Women's Party suffragists were arrested and served time in prison for their civil disobedience, including Sue White. They were, of course, just exercising their First Amendment rights of assembly. The suffrage prisoners were held in decrepit, vermin-infested cells. They were physically assaulted, clubbed, tied to the wall, not allowed to read or write or even to speak to one another. They communicated by singing. And when they refused to eat, they were force-fed, tubes rammed down their noses. When they were released, they toured the country in what was called the Prison Special. And in fact, they came through Tennessee in a Pullman car, 28 crammed in there. And at every stop in every city, they would hold marches and meetings and rallies, and they'd say, "We are your daughters, your wives, even your mothers, and we have been arrested and tortured for asking for the vote." And this began to change minds. Finally, in the summer of 1919, when World War I was over, and while the nation was suffering through an influenza pandemic, the federal amendment was passed by both houses of Congress and sent to the states for ratification. A year later, in the summer of 1920, the amendment was on the cusp of victory, or possibly defeat, as it arrived in Tennessee. Because Tennessee was a dangerous place to be staging this definitive battle for women's suffrage. Nearly all the other southern states had already rejected the amendment for the same rationales, protecting states' rights and not wanting Black women to vote. Suffragists knew that they faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. Tennessee was their last best hope. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage gathered in Nashville, and each side lawyered up. Some of the most prominent attorneys in Tennessee got involved in the fight on both sides, bringing their legal skills into the State House, into the courthouse, and into the public arena. The Tennessee Bar Association was, well, wishy-washy in its support, or lack thereof, for ratification. But many Tennessee attorneys were working for the cause. You'll meet them in my book. And on the national level, former Justice Charles Evan Hughes was on retainer. Charles Evan Hughes was on retainer for the suffragists. He took on many of the legal challenges, the injunctions, the suits, the Supreme Court arguments thrown into the path of the amendment. The anti-suffragists had their own all-star legal team. The American Constitutional League, the legal arm of the anti-suffrage movement, boasted many respected lawyers in its leadership ranks. The Tennessee Constitutional League was led by the influential and stridently anti-suffrage Nashville attorney John Vertrees. The Constitution League's lawyers challenged the ratifications of several states which had already voted, attempting to get them overturned. And they convinced many law associations to actively oppose, or at least withhold support of the amendment, as was the case with the Tennessee Bar. There were powerful forces working against ratification in Tennessee, political, corporate, and ideological foes, each with their own reasons for opposing the amendment. Politicians who feared this unpredictable new voting bloc. 27 million women across the country would be eligible to vote, and no one knew how they would vote. Corporations that believed women would be bad for their business. The textile manufacturers were afraid women voters might want to abolish child labor. and the mills relied upon that cheap labor pool. Railroad companies, very powerful in Tennessee, worked against women's suffrage. It said the railroads owned the Tennessee legislature. And if women voters voted out the industry's friends, well, then it could get expensive buying new ones. The liquor industry feared that women voters would insist on strict enforcement of the new prohibition laws. Now, in 1920, prohibition was already in effect, but they hoped that if women could be kept from the polls, it just wouldn't be enforced very stringently. And the liquor lobby sponsored a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel, where everyone was staying, which came to be known as the Jack Daniels Suite, where legislators were plied 24/7 with free liquor and encouraged to vote against ratification. And there are wonderful scenes of legislators coming out of the Jack Daniels Suite, bouncing off the walls, singing at the top of their lungs, and they have to be thrown in the showers to sober up before they can be taken into the chamber to vote. It's fair to say that quite a few attorneys who opposed ratification in Tennessee were doing the bidding of their corporate clients. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women. That women might oppose their own enfranchisement was shocking to me when I first encountered it in my research. But I learned that many of these aunties, as they were called, were social and religious and cultural conservatives who feared that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles. It would endanger the American home and bring about what they called the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter private life as well as public life. And that was what made it so dangerous. Now, this is an important reminder that the debate over women's suffrage was never just a political argument. It was also a social, cultural, and moral debate about women's role in society. And in that way, it was really a precursor to what we call the culture wars. In the Tennessee ratification fight, the anti-suffragists were led by Josephine Anderson Pearson of Monteagle, who came to Nashville to protect her native state from the feminist peril. In the first part of August, all sides confronted one another in Nashville, and it got wild. There were bribes and booze, propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies, kidnappings, and fistfights. The newspapers called it Suffrage Armageddon. And the outcome did remain in doubt until the very last moment. And I won't spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. Harry Thomas Byrne of Nyota. Harry was just 24 years old, in his freshman term, reading law at night, up for re-election in the fall. He had everything to lose, but his mother reminded him to do the right thing, and he did. In Knoxville, there is a wonderful new statue on Market Square celebrating Harry Byrne and his mother, Feb. But the victory was not won by Harry alone. Credit is due to the many other Tennessee men in the legislature and in the community who stood up for the amendment and for women's equality, making it possible for Harry to break a tie vote. Many of these were lawyers, including Delegate Joe Hanover of Memphis, who came to Tennessee as an immigrant child, believed in the American dream, and was appalled that his own mother could not vote. He put himself through law school at night. He ran for office. He worked hard to advance women's suffrage throughout his time in the legislature. And during the ratification fight, he signed up for hazardous duty as floor manager to guide the amendment through the Tennessee House. His passion and his canny maneuvers kept the suffrage forces in line. Hanover suffered verbal assaults and even death threats. The governor ordered bodyguards to protect him, but he never wavered. Joe went on to establish one of the largest law firms in Memphis. We celebrate Harry Byrne now, but then he was vilified for his stand on ratification. He was accused of taking a bribe. He was subjected to indignation rallies and impeachment petitions. I believe in women's suffrage as a right, he said in his own defense, and it's always best for a son to listen to his mother. The people of Nyota re-elected Harry in the fall election. But others did not fare as well. Governor Albert Roberts was defeated because of his stand supporting ratification. And in a strange footnote, not often mentioned, a few weeks after Harry Byrne's dramatic vote, the anti-suffrage contingent in the legislature pulled a fast and dirty parliamentary maneuver and actually rescinded Tennessee's ratification. It didn't really matter. It was legally moot, but it does show how controversial and divisive the 19th Amendment still was. Even after ratification was complete, the American Constitutional League lawyers brought suit against the 19th Amendment on states' rights grounds and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. Those cases were not decided until 1922 in a decision written by Justice Brandeis, dismissing the objections. Now, all this took place exactly a century ago, but the Tennessee ratification story has surprising and even unnerving modern themes. It deals with topics that are in our headlines right now: voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, and racism. Because the history of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there are cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked in a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is waved in defiance. There are important lessons to be learned from the fight for women's suffrage: that social change is slow and political change is hard. That protest is patriotic, but it must be followed up by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just march and picket. They debated and lobbied and drafted legislation and campaigned. And they did not rest after the 19th Amendment entered the Constitution. Carrie Chapman Catt founded the League of Women Voters, and Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, the next step in achieving women's equality under the law. It was introduced into Congress in 1923. Its delayed ratification just last year will be decided in the courts. Another lesson we learn from the suffrage movement is that the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It was not accomplished in 1920. It's not complete today. While the 19th Amendment did give the vote to all women, Black women in Tennessee and in the southern states would not be able to enjoy their right to vote for another 4 decades. Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation and violence kept them from the polls until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided legal remedy. In recent years, essential enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act have been gutted by the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby County versus Holder. We see an alarming number of states enact laws restricting access to the polls aimed at targeted voters, including in Tennessee, in that beautiful state house where the 19th Amendment was ratified. The legislature has made it harder to register, harder to vote, even as Tennessee has one of the worst voter participation rates in the country. As you know, these measures are now being challenged in court by voting rights organizations, including the League of Women Voters. Today, it's our responsibility once again to summon the courage to protect voting rights. We as a nation, you as members of the bar and citizens of Tennessee, cannot and should not accept these cynical attempts to rob Tennesseans of their right to vote. Voting rights is not a partisan issue. It is the stress test of the health of our democracy. And we as a nation and Tennessee as a state is too often failing that test. Tennessee is celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment right now. And I'm here to help commemorate your state's proud legacy of standing up for an improved and expanded democracy, standing up when it counted. The most fitting way to celebrate this historic occasion is to stand up again, as the Tennessee suffragists, women and men, did, as Harry Byrne and Joe Hanover did, as Frankie Pierce did, to reclaim Tennessee's role in expanding democracy as it did as a state in 1920. You, members of the bar, who are legislators and elected officials, you who are concerned and influential citizens, it's time to speak up loudly and unequivocally and to act, rededicating Tennessee to the promise that every citizen be able to vote without barriers, without difficulty, without fear. The legal profession is critical to the fight for a better and more inclusive democracy. Lawyers are again on the barricades. The struggle to make the preamble of the Constitution, "We the people," ring loud and true continues. History is watching. Thank you very much.